Okay. All right, we are live on YouTube. This is 2021 Puget Sound Pagan Pride Day, and this workshop is Equity in the Circle with Terry Wolf. And I'll go ahead and go on mute.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, so give me just a moment. Okay. How are we doing? Is everyone seeing that? Hello? Did I lose anybody?
I still see you. It does not appear that we are sharing your screen.
All right. You know, it's one of those days. All right.
Okay, well, while you work on that, I'll just read your your description about your workshop. So this is Equity in the Circle, building a safer space for everyone. As social justice awareness becomes more widespread, folks are demanding more of their magical spaces. The question becomes how to adjust your tradition or practice to accommodate these differing needs. We will.
Are we sharing now?
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you for bearing with me because, yeah, not my forte. So great, thanks. Thanks for reading that, and thanks for coming to my presentation, Equity in the Circle. I'm so pleased that you guys are here. My goal is to start a conversation about equity in magical spaces and in our community. And I think it's really important to call each other into these conversations. And I want to tell you that I am queer, I am neurodivergent, I am a trans person, and I am disabled. So when I talk about equity, this is the lens that I'm speaking from. And having said that, I will not get everything perfect in this workshop, and that's okay. I think it's more important to do this work imperfectly and learn from it as we go than to wait until things are perfect and maybe not do it at all. So I'm here to start a conversation, and my email and my Facebook are at the end of this presentation. I've included the link to this PowerPoint in the chat. So anybody who wants to get in contact with me, or any people of color who are watching this who want to hand me my butt later, I'll consider it a learning experience. So from there, here we go. So this is me. I'm Terry Wolf. I'm a workshop presenter and speaker for over 15 years in the community. I'm clergy and founding member of the Congregation of the Present Heart, California nonprofit, religious nonprofit. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist and NLP practitioner. And I have been working for a number of years with a talented group of priesthood to bring consent awareness into magical spaces, especially within the community. I've also served on several magical nonprofits, and I have a passion for social justice and equity, and putting that passion to work for advocacy for Black and trans lives. So this is what we'll be talking about today. What is equity and why equity? equity in magical spaces, anti-racism and cultural appropriation awareness, creating a culture of consent within magical practices, circles that accommodate everyone, and to accommodate gender diversity in magical space. So I'm going to define a couple terms before I start. I'm sure that most people don't need this, but I like to have a common understanding of what I mean when I use certain language. So I'm going to talk about privilege. When I use that word, I mean an unearned advantage afforded to some by accident of birth or circumstance. Consent. I got this definition from pagan consent culture, which is 1, permission to engage in an activity or be acted upon, and 2, not the absence of no, but the presence of an enthusiastic yes. Anti-racism, I took 2 definitions because I like them both. A belief or doctrine that rejects the supremacy of one racial group over another and works for racial equality in society. Anti-racism encompasses a range of ideas and political actions which are meant to counter racial prejudice, systemic racism, and the oppression of specific racial groups. One of those was from Webster's dictionary, and the other was from Wikipedia. White supremacy is the basic belief that white people are better than other races and cultures, and the structures and systems that support that belief. And then patriarchy, the basic belief that male bodies are more valuable than female bodies, and the social structures and systems that support that belief. So what is equity? So for a long time, social justice was centered around the idea of equality. And equality sounds like a great idea. Everyone having the same. But if you take privilege into consideration, the advantages, the unearned advantages that some have by a circumstance of birth or just their situation, if you give everyone the same, then you're going to come out at the end with those advantages still being in place, and the disadvantage is still being in place that you started with. So the allegory for this is a picture of there's a ball game going on, and there's a fence, and there's some people trying to see over and get. And this is like a metaphor for access in our culture. Some people are trying to look over this fence to see the ball game, and there's a tall, able-bodied person, and a short, able-bodied person, and a person in a wheelchair. Now, none of them can see the ball game. In equality, you give everybody the same size box. And the tall person can get up on the box and they can see the ball game just fine. And the short, able-bodied person gets up on the box, they can't see anything. And the person in the wheelchair can't even get up on the box. So that's equality. In equity, you take down the fence. That way everybody has access. Or if you can't take down the fence, you certainly make sure that everybody has a different size box and that the person in the wheelchair has a way to get on top of it. So the definition is from Brandeis University, that true equity implies that an individual may need to experience something different, but not equal, in order to maintain fairness and access. The example is a person in a wheelchair may need different accommodation to have equitable access as compared to an able-bodied person. Equity reflects processes and practices that both acknowledge that we live in a world where not everyone has been afforded the same resources and treatment, while also working to remedy that fact. So why? Why equity? We live in a world of unequal power dynamics. unequal power relationships based on oppression, which is expressed in a myriad of ways. Gender, race, class, gender identity and expression, size, age, and other characteristics. And around these relationships, we have both explicit and unspoken social rules around who can touch others without permission, exploit their vulnerabilities, or even commit violent acts against another's body. This is the missing Indigenous women, the missing children, the Black women who have their hair touched without permission, the women who become pregnant, all of a sudden their bellies are public domain. Children can be touched without permission. And the more a person can be touched without permission, the more vulnerable and less protected they are within the social hierarchy. This is why consent is so important. We'll get to that later. So I love this quote, and it's from reevaluation counseling, which my child is very much a part of, and passes me some of the wisdom every once in a while, which is that oppression makes us stupid. And obviously it doesn't make us literally stupid. We still have all of our intelligence intact, but our brain is full of mirror neurons. We are literally hardwired for empathy. In order to participate in the oppression of others and to benefit, and even to tacitly benefit from the oppression of others, we have to have a series of survival strategies for that, which include numbing and defensiveness, and twisting ourselves into knots, and being literally blind to seeing it when it's right in front of our face. And a good example of this is what was happening last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, where we were seeing images every day of Black people and their allies standing in front of rubber bullets and tear gas, and the horror of that. And then white people coming back with how unsafe they felt. And that in that scenario, unsafe was not valid. Obviously, it was the Black people who were unsafe and are on the daily. But that the oppression, even just seeing this, twisted people up into their oppressor material and seeing, and this oppression makes us stupid. It makes us stupid. We cannot look at it even when it's in front of our face. Now, we live in a world of so much interlocking systems of oppression, and this is where it gets sticky, that many of us are both oppressed in some way and also oppressor in some way. So this is where there's some work to do to unpack that. And I'll just leave that on the table. Okay, so we have equity. Why equity and what it is. So I'm going to talk a tiny bit about anti-racism and cultural appropriation. Wish me luck. All right. So I'm going to start with saying that I am not the best person to speak at this event on anti-racism. the best person, of course, would be a person of color. So I'm not going to spend very much time on this, except to say that it's important to bring equity into any magical space. I think we have to be actively anti-racist. And I think there's a few ways that we can do that, although these are my ideas from my learning and from what I've listened to and from what I've experienced working in other groups. And I don't claim that my learning is complete or that I know everything. So I put this out here with that caveat. I will start with saying, if you're white, it's not a matter of whether or not you have implicit biases. It's a matter of how many and how bad they are. So considering some kind of training around that or education is a good idea. Learn to listen more than speak. Be conscious of power dynamics, especially when you're talking to people of color or Indigenous people or both. Invite, if you can, people of color and Indigenous people into your leadership, in your circles, in your organizations, and elevate the voices of Indigenous and Black folks. Trust their lived experience. Understand that white supremacy is harmful to other groups as well. So when you elevate queer and trans and young people, disabled women, poor people, working class people in your community, that this is also anti-racism work. And this is not an instead of, this is an in addition to. All right, so you can let me know if I got that wrong. All right, so cultural appropriation. This is something that that I'm bringing to the table as it would be great for us to start a discussion around cultural appropriation in the pagan community. So I'm going to say some controversial things here, and please understand that I'm not trying to make anybody wrong, but I am trying to bring in a conversation that includes awareness of the harm of cultural appropriation, and that a lot of the traditions within the pagan community have had at its core some kind of cultural appropriation or another. And I don't claim to have the answers to that, but just that it's our responsibility to clean it up. So I asked some questions. I'm just going to ask the questions. And then I can tell my own story. And then maybe we can talk about it a little bit if anybody wants to. So some helpful questions are to consider your tradition. What are its origins? Who founded it? What was going on at that time? What was that time period like for women and children and Indigenous people? Where was it in the world? Was colonization happening? Was genocide happening? You know, what were the attitudes of appropriation and extraction and exploitation? How might these attitudes still be influencing your tradition? So I'll just tell you my story. So I was, you know, a couple of years into my anti-racism work, and I was feeling pretty good about where I'd gotten to. I got it. I understood what was happening. I was like really starting to see my patterns and what was going on, and seeing how it all fit together systemically. And I was listening to these voices every day. I changed the media that I watched and all the books that I read, and was really starting to change my thinking. And then I I really started hearing, these voices saying how painful it was to have their gods, taken without consideration of their culture, and how it was part of genocide. The genocide is just not just killing people, but it's part of erasing culture and identity over time, and how harmful that is. And it really hit me. And I looked around my house and my 6 or 7 altars I had around, and every image on there had been taken from another culture without their permission. And every god that I had up was the same. They were not from anywhere near my lineage, or that I could trace. I mean, I don't know enough about my own lineage, but it hit me hard. This was my spirituality. These were my gods. This was my faith. And it was really, really unmaking in a very powerful way. Made me want to run, and maybe never ever look at this work again, but I didn't do that. It was a pretty deep grief as well. But what I know is, no matter how deep my grief is, it is not as deep as what people of color are going through every day and having their cultures taken, and that I need to feel it. And so my practice is now is I've gone back to the earth and to the ancestors, and I'm taking a very slow and measured approach to the gods, and just working to re-indigenize myself, to find out more about my own lineage and my own gods, who, at some point were taken from me. And, I think that's what whiteness does, is it extracts and demands this homogenization that takes our heritage and our ancestors and our gods from us. That's how I see it anyway. So I cannot do it to another. So that's my story of cultural appropriation. That's a personal one, and I don't have answers. I only have questions, and I'm only about a year into my own journey around it. So I really look forward to any conversation anyone's willing to have with me around this, because I understand it's hugely controversial. So that's all I'll say about that, and we'll move on to questions. Anybody have anything they want to say about this to me? And if you don't, I could see why. Nina?
I'm here.
Okay, good.
Hi, this is Brianne. Terry, I want to take a moment to thank you for sharing that story and for holding this space to have this conversation. I know, especially in a lot of white neo-pagan circles, it can get very tense very fast to tell people that the way they're worshiping Ganesh or any other, that's just one that comes to mind of especially if we look at Hindu gods, that's a living religion still practiced by millions of people around the world. And people can get really defensive and really angry really fast when we start talking about why it may be problematic for them to have an altar or to work with Ganesh, and how to do that respectfully, if at all. And I just really appreciate how you said, and I wrote it down because it was so meaningful, that no matter how deep my grief is, it is not as deep as the grief of people of color and those being robbed, their culture being robbed. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's I'm just going to let it be there for a minute. Thank you.
I would love it if you could possibly expand on how we may find ourselves as oppressors, whether that is our intention or not.
Oh, sure. That is really, really good. And you know, the thing is, we are oppressed into being the oppressors, and also this is a multi-generational legacy, right? This has been handed. This is ancestral, multi-generational. What I'm coming to consider trauma, and I don't mean to equate this in any way with the multi-generational trauma of the oppressed, of people of color or indigenous people. However, hurt humans hurt other humans, if that makes sense. Does that make sense to anyone? And so, again, we are hardwired for empathy. For us to do this to other humans, we are hurting ourselves. And the ways that we have, the first thing that I hit in doing my anti-racism work was the pain that I'm carrying to run racism at other people. Right. And as painful as it is to feel it, it is a huge relief not to be blind and numb around that. And much of this, we were hammered into being and doing long before we had cognitive thought around it. Now, that doesn't let us off the hook from doing the work now. It's just that we've got to release ourselves from the good-bad binary that says, if I'm a good person, I can't be an oppressor. You know, it just is the way it is. Like, we're this way because our ancestors were this way. And they may also have been the oppressed. Like, if you give any human enough advantage, they'll take advantage of it without thinking about it. And the way that we have our system set up, there is a basic lie at the root of, I'm just going to take white supremacy because I think this is like the overarching one. Like, we can talk about all the other systems of oppression, but I think that if you do anti-racism first, it'll dismantle all the other ones first after that. And I can be wrong about this. You can hand me my hat if I'm wrong, and that I'm willing to be wrong. But this is the way that I see it. I think that white supremacy is the big granddaddy, and if you dismantle that, it'll help you dismantle all the other systems of oppression, because there's a huge lie there. And that is that that basic lie that, you know, on some level, some humans are just basically better than others, just basically better. And it's not ever spoken about. It is so internalized. And then every system and every institution and everything is built on this basic assumption. And we don't have to think about it. And white people can pretty much have the privilege to move through their entire, we're so segregated, we can move through our entire lives with pretty much no racial stress at all. We don't even have to come up against questioning that assumption until something like last summer happens. And then it's like, well, wait a minute, what? So we didn't build those systems. That was built, you know, hundreds of years ago and then reinforced with every generation, because it's kind of like the water that we're swimming in and the air that we're breathing. It's hard to know it's there. Does that answer the question at all?
Yes, and you definitely added to the things that I was thinking about. Thank you.
I could talk quite a long time about that. And I do have a few other things that I speak about in the rest of the presentation. But I do want to take a moment to point things back to content creators in our community who are people of color. You know, this is certainly not any kind of, I've only got 3 on here, which is probably a sign of my racism, but Canyon Sayers, and I'm from Northern California. And so this is where a lot of these people are centered. Canyon Sayers is an Indigenous person from Northern California. And they have a Facebook page called Canyon Consulting. There's so much content on there. There are videos. There is so much content about Indigenous voices and what they are saying. I cannot recommend this enough. And also, like from there, you can find other Indigenous people who are putting out content specifically for white people to learn from. So I recommend Canyon. Luna Pantera is a Black woman in the Bay Area who does ancestor work and is amazing. That's her website. Check her out. And Laura O'Brien is talking about cultural appropriation of Irish paganism and Irish Celtic paganism. And this is a big deal within the pagan community because so many of the traditions have their roots in appropriating culture, Irish paganism. And so this is kind of cleaning that up. And she says anybody can practice Irish paganism, but they should do it without culturally appropriating it because it is harmful to the Irish culture, which is, not a culture that, it is a culture that, well, as any cultural appropriation does, it harms the culture that it comes from. So there's all kinds of content in the Irish pagan school, but also you can look up Laura O'Brien. She's an author, et cetera, et cetera. So I did want to take a moment to shout out to these people in the community that are doing this work. All right, so we've talked about equity and anti-racism and cultural appropriation. And so now we're going to talk about consent. And I believe that consent is part of equity. And for anyone here who thinks that consent is only part of sexual practices, I'm going to disabuse you of that, that right now. I believe that consent should be part of our every interaction. And here's why. Well, first I'll start with this quote, that consent draws its moral force from the idea that individual freedom and autonomy is a basic human right. So if we are, if we are talking about equity, being aware of power dynamics and being aware of everyone having what they need, fair access, fair and equitable access to resources and to equitable treatment within the society, then we need to be aware of our power dynamics. And one of the ways we become aware of our power dynamics is by practicing consent and treating everyone with this autonomy. Another quote that I like is that in a culture of consent, the individual is considered to be the best judge of their own wants and needs. And right now, that is not the way our culture works. It may appear that it does, but it does not. There are whole groups of people who are excluded from this. And right now, with the Texas abortion ban, there's certainly, half the population that's been decided that they're not being able to be judges of their own wants and needs. Female-bodied people are often considered not the best judge. Certainly the elderly, certainly, the young people, even people under 30 often are not considered to be the best judge of their own wants and needs. Because young people oppression is real. Young people oppression is the training oppression for all other oppression. Get them while they're young. And then, of course, the disabled. And, I'm sure that we can think of others. And the more marginalized you are, the less you are considered to be the best judge of your own wants and needs. So in a culture of consent, the individual is considered to be the best judge of their own wants and needs. So how do we create a culture of consent in our circles? It has to start with, being communication. And I think it really starts before that by us being aware of ourselves. Be aware of ourselves and our privilege and our own intersectionalities. So that we can show up to the table. But communication is really, really important. And anybody who practices consent will talk about communication a lot. But I think one of the things that gets lost in this idea of communication is the listening part. We need to listen a lot. And not just listen, but believe, because one of the things that happens is whenever there's a power disparity is this idea of the person with a lesser, the less amount of power in the dynamic is not considered to be as believable. So let's think about this, like people of color are not considered as believable as white people. Female-bodied people are not considered to be as believable as male-bodied people. Trans and queer folk are not as believable as cishet people. And it's because of the power dynamic. So it's not just about listening and talking, it's about believing the communication. I hope that makes sense. And so the greater the power disparity, the more necessary it is to listen rather than to speak. And again, believe what you hear. Honor the autonomy of everyone's body. So this idea that you can touch anybody without permission, gone. And it's interesting to note the times when you feel like you can. And as when you're changing any behavior, of course, you know, it's going to start with, oh, shoot, I just touched that person. Why did I think I could do that? And unpacking it. And then pretty soon you'll back it up to where you're aware you're about to touch someone. And then you'll back it up to where you're not touching people, but you might have the thought. And then pretty soon you won't even have the thoughts. But it's got to be a practice, right? Be actively anti-racist and conscious of the power dynamics around you, especially in magical space. Magical space is vulnerable. It's vulnerable for people. And we need to make sure that we're aware of that. And then make accommodations. And I'm going to talk about that later for disability and other things that people might need and different neurologies. Okay, moving on. Okay, communication at every level and at all times. The request replaces the command. We don't tell people what to do anymore. We just say, if it's your will you join us? We're doing this, you know, we're going to do this thing. We hope you'll do it with us. It's an invite. It's an invitation. It's an allowing. It's not a command. And there's some traditions that have a lot of commanding in there. And I'm not here to make anybody wrong, but I am here to say, like, look at that, because it doesn't go along with consent. Explicit permission is obtained for every act. Anything that's going to be acted upon the body. If you're asperging, if you're smoke busing, if you're going to touch anybody in any way during a ritual or in any kind of magical practice, you receive their consent. And you can talk about, there are ways to do this that are not super clunky. And I could talk a little bit about that if anybody wants me to, but it's very important to receive that consent. You get multiple levels of participation so that people with different abilities can join at the level that they're capable of, and complete trust is placed in the autonomy of each person. So I'm going to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about for this. And ritual, if that's cool. So the group I'm part of did the last Pantheacon, which, you know, there's no more, but before the pandemic started, was the last one. And it was 300 people showed up to our ritual. We didn't know any of these people, but we had planned in advance what we would do. We knew that some people coming would be elders or disabled people. And it was a moving ritual. We were going to be moving all the time. We wanted to make sure that we accommodated people. So when people were waiting outside the door, some of the priesthood went out and invited anybody. And you know, it's like you had to prove it. Anybody who was going to want to sit during the ritual up to the front. And then people who wanted to sit, they were all accommodated in this one area. Then they were told that this was a moving ritual and what was going to happen. And that if they wanted a lot of movement and participation, they should stay in the middle. If they wanted a little less, they could stay closer to the outside. And if they wanted to kind of sit on the ground and just be in the space, but not be moving a lot, they could be on the outside of the circle. So we had 300 people, and it was all moving all the time, but you had disability accommodated in the back. We had some people who didn't want to be moving that much, so they were kind of sitting or just standing on the outside of the circle. You had some people moving slower, a little closer, and you had the people very, very active on the inside of the circle. And people were also moving in and out of those different levels throughout the ritual. And that's how you accommodate different levels of of ability in one ritual. So, wink. All right. So is there anybody who wants to talk about consent?
Just chiming in real quick, we've got about 8 minutes left.
Okay, great. I'll move on then. Okay, circles that accommodate everyone. I've already kind of started talking about this. So we need circles that accommodate everyone as part of equity and also part of consent. You never know who's going to be in your circle. So the best way to do this is just to imagine that they're already there. The chemically sensitive, people with sensory issues, the disabled, the clean and sober. Just imagine that they're already in your circle and plan for accommodation. So consider the disabled and have plenty of comfortable seating and multiple levels of participation. Consider the chemically sensitive and have, especially if you're using incense or smoke, you have to make sure that it's far away from anybody who would be chemically sensitive. And the safest thing to do is just to not have it, or only have it in specific places where you have double checked with everyone to make sure that they're not going to be harmed. And have alternatives like asperging or something else that's not going to make people have a miserable time for the next week. Consider those who with sensory dynamics, who are very sensitive to loud noises or the like. Consider dietary restrictions, provide ingredients for all the food that you're going to offer. And consider the clean and sober by always, you might even ask people, allow people to come to you before the ritual and tell them your needs around that. But certainly do not put a chalice with alcohol into the hands of the clean and sober without an alternative. Communicate to see what other accommodations might be needed in your circles. Okay, and I've got one more thing I'm going to talk about, and that is, and I'm just going to touch on this because it's a big topic. I could do a whole, I probably will do another workshop just on this, and that is gender diversity and the gods in magical space. So accommodating gender diversity. So I'm trans non-binary. And I'm just going to tell you a story that we started doing a few years for the gender non-conforming folk in our community. So our tradition invokes the goddess and god into the circle. And there were a number of trans folk, and that felt very, who were either in transition or who were gender non-conforming, and that felt very restrictive and uncomfortable. And so we started also invoking the divine as the oneness that's beyond gender identity. And this allowed for a space for to approach the divine for those who were gender non-conforming. And we would build altars. There would be 3 altars for the goddess, the god, and the divine. And this is not like a perfect solution. It offered a lot of healing for our circle, though, and it allowed a jumping off point and a conversation to start. There was a lot of wounding in that community that had happened before, the priesthood that I was part of took leadership around, around gender issues. This is something that can be done. But what I would also say is that there is a way to approach the gods that is not so one of these two boxes, the male box, the female box, and the gods go in one of these two boxes. I don't think the gods fit in any boxes, but our part of white supremacy is this very, very restrictive idea of gender. And I'm going to say something that some may not agree with, but I'm going to say it anyway. And that is that gender is a social construct. Sex is biological, gender is social construct. And a lot of it is oppression. And so that our thinking has been infected with this. And then therefore our ideas of the gods as being certain ways. And so I'm inviting everybody into a more flexible idea around how the gods express themselves, especially in your circles with people who are gender nonconforming. And I don't have time to go much deeper into that, except to just give everybody an invitation and put it on the table. And I think that's what I've got time for today. We talked about all these things, and I really appreciate you joining me. Really pleased that I got to present this topic. This is me. Please contact me if you will.
There are some comments that there is interest in you're doing a whole workshop on gender diversity in magical space. So that would be wonderful to potentially consider for next year if you're able.
Yes, I would love that.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you very much for your time, for joining us. Thank you to those who have participated in this workshop today. Lots and lots of things to think about and consider. A lot of good introspection that we can all do. And when we look at the faults of others, to turn inward beforehand. So it's really, really profound. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I really appreciate everyone being here, and this was amazing. Thank you.
All right. Look forward to next year then. Thank you so